And where we left off, like I said, we're a little behind. So this slideshow, if you're looking for it, is actually in chapter 2. I was looking for my presenter, which seems to not be here, but that's okay. We left off really at this idea of where software, and we want to talk about software. So we divide it into two major areas. System software, those that include things like the operating system, utilities, and then things that do something specific. Okay, so maybe we need a better example of that. So our system software, when I buy a new tablet, computer, or something, it comes with software. It comes with, if I buy a computer, it comes with Windows or Mac. Is there a third operating system I can buy a computer on? What's the one that they use in all the high schools? Starts with a C. Chrome. Chrome OS is a really good option. If I buy a phone, it comes with an operating system. Generally either Apple iOS or it comes with Android. Are there other options? That's about 99% of the phone market, but are there some other options? Yeah, there's some other weird ones. If you're like, and I'll use my dad as an example, love my dad, handing him a smartphone is probably not a great idea. He's got an old style flip phone that's got a little tiny operating system they wrote that is very basic. It's another version of that. Huawei is trying to write their own software for their phones. One of the largest makers of phones and telecommunications equipment in the world. Well, for a lot of political reasons and probably some reality, they are an arm of the People's Republic of China. They are owned by or controlled by. And so, and the United States government banned them from anything in the US. Google said, well, you can't have our Android operating system. They're trying to write programs. And they actually make some really great hardware. Their phones are really amazing if we could use them, but now kind of we're banned from doing that. They were also making a lot of the equipment for this 5G revolution you're going to see coming, where you're going to have how your phones are going to be even faster than they are on the internet. Sadly, not around here, but in bigger cities. They were making the hardware and the infrastructure for that, and we banned them. So we have an issue there. But these are kind of the types. Application software, then. Application software is things that actually do something. So what kind of software do we buy that does something for us? What do you get free from our college now? Microsoft Office 365. So let me ask you a question. Is it really free? No. No. Bill Gates is not the second richest person in the world because he gave stuff away, is he? No. So what other software do we use? What other software do we use? If I want to make little videos that are about 9 to 15 seconds long, what software can I use? Snapchat, or the latest one that the government wants to ban right now is TikTok. So why would we want to ban TikTok? Does anybody make TikTok videos in here? No judging. Does anybody make them? They're kind of fun to watch. But did you also know that TikTok is the #1 sex trafficking app in the United States? Yikes. All of a sudden you guys are like, ooh, that's kind of creepy. And you think, well, we're out in the middle of nowhere. So Nebraska City and the Walmart specifically, because it's a nice big parking lot, do you realize that is a heavily sex trafficked area? Because that is where people come to exchange people and money, because it's an intersection north, south, east, west. But it's not in a major city, so people think they can get away with that. Ooh. So software is not always as fun and exciting as we thought. And I will give you an example of that. My 10-year-old thought that it was really clever. She would create these little TikTok videos. And she's 10. And so her and her friends, they got their shirts tied up so their belly's hanging out and their butts and they're shaking and they're watching inappropriate videos and shaking them to it. I found that out. And I saw one video of hers. And I don't remember the song, but it was completely inappropriate, and we've had some ramifications from that. within one day it had 1,800 hits. And when you start looking at where that's at, it's not other 10-year-olds that are watching that stuff. So, my little take on TikTok. Are there other software we use? What else can we use? Nothing else? What about Facebook? All kinds of social media apps out there. What about apps to do video editing? Do we do any of that? Yeah. What about software for accounting? You think accounting is going to be a big software? So I'll pick on you, Bailey, because I know where you were working this for an internship. What kind of software did they use for accounting? QuickBooks? Mass 90 by some chance? No? Do what? Okay. So there's other software out there. So we may have specialized accounting software, ERP software, enterprise resource planning software. You may do payroll on something. What about email? Do you guys all live on email? All your stuff at the college comes from email. So you may have specialized email software. Maybe you're a graphic artist and you want to draw something. Is there specialized software? That's all things that do something. So if I think about that in terms of the operating system exists and it gives me a place to then do something with it. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those pieces. So there is an area called middleware, which is kind of that software that sits in between for us. Operating systems, we've talked about a few of them. There are some we have not looked at yet. Mac OS. How many have a Mac in here? I know there's several. All right. Mac OS, we have Windows 10 would be the majority of you. There may be some of you that run something called Linux or a Chromebook. There's lots of different types of operating systems. Windows 10 is great, I think, as far as an operating system. It's the majority, but it's expensive. If I go out and buy a copy of it, it's $200. If I buy a computer that's already got it pre-installed, they've paid about $50 to Microsoft. There's a reason. So we want to look at some of the pieces that lie in between. What does that operating system do? And why is a Mac operating system more secure and safe than a Windows operating system? And we can explain both of those by thinking about what it does. So, at the very tiny heart is something called the kernel. So, that is kind of that very inside piece that does all the math, does all the operations, and it pulls every other aspect of it together. So the kernel is kind of the secure piece in the center. So that kernel then gives us the ability to manage memory, do tasks, provide networking, control access to resources, manage those files and figure out where they're stored. That user interface, how do I interface with the users? It's got to do things like, we got to figure out where that keyboard is or what other devices we're doing, how to store data. We may have a graphical user interface. In fact, almost every operating system now uses a GUI. You can move your mouse around and you can click. Are there operating systems that don't have that? On the server side, most of them don't have that graphic user interface. On the server, we don't need it. We're not showing you everything on a screen. We're doing things behind the scenes, so it takes less resources to do that. So you may have an operating system. This is all you see. When you try to run it, you see a screen like that. So that's kind of the difference between that GUI, or graphical user interface, and command line. The GUI is great if I'm going to do one thing. So if I scroll around and I find my spot, it works well. The command line lets me do things in batches and edits and do things automated. So it's more powerful but more complicated. So on your desktop, you generally just mess around with the GUI. You don't need to add 1,000 students' emails into a program. We do that on the GUI side. So memory management, hardware, how do we deal with all the different pieces of hardware? Memory management, how do I use that memory to store programs? How do I find it to run and store my data as I'm working? Processing, so there's a lot of things we talk about. That processor churns data. So allows multiple programs to be run at the same time. It used to be we could only run one program at a time, and we would have to stop it and run another program. You can still see that on a few things. On your phone, even though it's in the background, can you really run more than one thing at a time, or do you have to stop what you're doing? You got to stop. Yeah, I got to stop. What's a video game that's on a phone right now? My Sugar Crush or whatever it is. And I have to then go into Tender or whatever other program I'm running. Multitasking or multiprocessing allows us to run those programs at the same time. Multiprocessing says we can do it on more than one CPU. And even our phones now typically have 4 or more CPUs in them. Multi-threading says we have a program and it can allow different threads. So different pieces of that program can all run at the same time. So processing gets a little more exciting. Then we have the ability to connect to a network. Well, our phones wouldn't be very useful if we didn't have that ability to connect to a network. If they weren't connected to the world's biggest network, which is, what's the world's biggest network? Starts with an I. APU, Internet. The Internet's the world's biggest network. So if I didn't have that capability to connect to that network, it wouldn't be very useful for us. Our operating systems, almost all of them now have the ability to connect to a network. And then we have that idea of being able to see who and what used things, when they happened. File management, how do we store our programs? So here are some of the operating systems. This is not inclusive, but just on my computer. I have Microsoft Windows, Mac, Linux, Google, Android, or Chrome. HP WebOS is gone. This book is already out of date by the time we have that. HP abandoned it. They were trying to bring out another one. But when we get to bigger computer systems, so we say a work group, one that's a much bigger, powerful computer, well, we still can run Mac OS X. There's a server version. But things like HP UX or a version of Unix, IBM stuff starts popping up. And then on the server side or the enterprise side, then we typically have Windows Server or a Linux or a Unix server of some form. And the HP and the IBM are actually versions of Unix. And that the world revolves around that Unix stuff we're going to take a look at it, but the Unix stuff is what runs the world around us. About 90% of all the web servers out there are running some form of Unix on them. Your banking software all is running Unix. So personal computers, we really have a couple that are out there. So there's Windows 10. And Windows did something very similar to the Mac. They said, well, we're going to have Windows 10 and it's going to upgrade every couple of times a year. So there is always a spring update and a fall update of Windows. So even though we say we have Windows 10, we really need to know what version we have because it's vastly different. What they've done is kept the name and it's a completely new version of Windows that'll come out. Looks the same, but underneath they've changed that core, and a lot of what they work on is security in there. And those of you that are Mac users, well, El Capitan is not the latest version. What's the latest version of Mac? Oh, that might be a great bonus attendance question. So Mac has actually done something really interesting. Now that they said Windows stuck with 10, now there's going to be a Mac OS X 11 version. But they come up with some kind of unique names, and they're usually based on something in California. So here's one advantage that a Mac has. When we start looking at virtual pieces, I can run all kinds of virtual software on a Windows PC, except I cannot by law, because Apple doesn't allow it, I cannot run my Apple software on a Mac. On the other hand, on a Mac, I can actually set up and run Windows software. I can run a Windows 10 inside of my Mac. So there are some advantages to that Mac, and that's one of them. One of the other ones we talk a lot about is security. Well, the Macs by design are more secure. The Macs underneath them really are based on something called BSD, which is a version of Unix/Linux. It's designed to be more secure. But that's not really the reason that they are, in my opinion. It's one reason. There's a couple of other reasons. What percentage of computers sold are Macs? If I go into a business, what's that percentage? So colleges are a little weird. You're going to see more. But even here, I think we saw 3 hands out of 12 people. So 25% roughly. Maybe that's true on campuses. In business, it's far less than 10% are trying to run Macs. They sell far less. So if I'm somebody that says, hey, I'm going to try to escort businesses and make money and provide viruses, am I going to go after a small market share or the big market share? Probably going to go after the big market share. There is another piece to that. If I go into the Apple store, the only way I can buy a Mac is through Apple. There's no third party. And so there's about 7 different models. That's it. That's all the hardware they support. But if I want to buy a Windows 10 PC, how many companies can I buy them from? Where's a company I can buy a Windows 10 PC from? Walmart. You can go get a Walmart, but it's not really the brand. But Walmart will sell several brands. What's a brand of a PC? Dell, HP, Acer. There's literally hundreds of brands of PCs with thousands of different kinds of hardware. I have 7 different models of Mac and pieces of hardware I have to support. I can write that code really tightly because I don't have to support anything else in terms of security. Windows PC, there can be millions of different variations, different types of hardware, different types of software on there, and I'm trying to support all that. That's one of the reasons I think the Mac is more secure. It's based on a more secure operating system to start with. It's got less market share, so less people are trying to target it. And they can very tightly control it because they're the only ones that make it. I can't go buy a Mac made by Dell. And if I look at Dell, I can literally pick thousands upon thousands of different configurations. And I can go all the way from, I actually saw one the other day, somebody had a tablet that was a Windows 10 tablet they bought at Walmart that was $129. Do you think all that hardware has been secured and has made sure that it's going to be very secure? No. So that's one of the differences that's in there. Now, that said, can I get a virus on my Mac? Yes. There are some out there. If I am not careful with what I do out on the web, can I do bad things on a Mac just like I can on a PC? Can I get exploited on a Mac? Yeah. Can I get, as a CFO of my company, Chief Financial Officer, can I get hacked and send $13 million over to China that immediately bounces to other countries and disappears? Yes. Don't rely on anything like, hey, I got a Mac so I can never be hacked. Wrong. You got to use your brain a little bit. But where I want to lead to is something I think is probably the most exciting thing in computing. It's something called open source. Now, Linux is one of these versions of open source software. That's the operating system. Is anybody in here super cheap? Yeah, you guys are all like, yeah, I don't like to spend any money. So you guys should be excited by this, and we're going to play around with it a little bit. When I have something called Linux, they're open source. In other words, a group of developers has written this, and they give it to you and say, here you go. It's free. It's yours. You are also able to modify it if you really want to. So Linux has some base distributions, and then people will write things that go on the top of them. So the most popular one isn't OpenSUSE, I will tell you that. And we'll look at what a couple of the really popular ones are. But when I download this operating system, it's got, not only does it do everything Windows 10 does or Mac does, it's actually got application software built into it, and you download right with it in most cases. When I get my Mac or I get my PC, does it have a word processor on it immediately? Does it have any games built in onto it? Can it do video editing? Well, there's the Paint Shop and the very limited software, but very, very limited. And yet, when we download a Linux version, you're going to see that we can do everything possible right off the bat. So we're going to talk a lot about open operating systems because I think it's pretty important. We also have the Chrome one, and I think this is a critical piece. You've probably seen them in schools because they're cheap, but they're also really safe. If I'm going to go give a computer to grandma, and I need her not to screw it up, we've all got a grandma or a grandparent or a parent who the minute they get a computer, what do they do with it? Do they screw it up or do something weird? Yeah. So Google Chrome OS, and a lot of schools use it because it can run on inexpensive laptops, and it's really pretty good. It does everything kind of in a browser, so your software sits in a browser. So it does need to be connected to the internet for a lot of things, but I also have a lot of control over it. So I do work with some cities, and one of the cities I work with is Fall City, and they have a council, a group of people that run your city. So in this case, I think there's 8 of them down there. And we looked at what can we do? Do we give them a computer? Because they're just going to mess that up. And we actually gave them Chrome OS laptops that they can use, little tablets with a keyboard. And here's what I did that I thought was kind of clever. We actually gave them models that were designed for 3rd graders so that they can be dropped on the floor and they can't hurt them hardly. Because the last versions that we had were a little more fragile, and there were a couple of council people who couldn't plug the charger in properly even. There's always that person, and Chrome OS is great for those models. Great for that. One of the downsides, it's great for K through 12. You get to upper division, and you can't run some of the software we're wanting to run. There's not QuickBooks for it. So if I'm an accountant, well, crap. And it doesn't run a full version of Office 365. And one of the features that I think it lacks when we do try to run Office on it, or a version, when you write a research paper, is it very handy inside of Microsoft Word that it can create that database for you of all your entries and put in your footnotes for you and all those things automatically? That's not available. Now, there's other things that it does differently, but Chrome OS is pretty good. And I'll bring one in. I can't apparently show them across the classroom, but they're pretty interesting, I think. We then have Windows and Unix servers. So a server lets us run all kinds of things. We can run a website. We can put tools inside of a company. So things like, how do I manage printers? How do I manage the computers? How do I have file storage? So we basically have 2 different types, a Unix or a Windows server. Unix, very powerful, typically a little more complicated to administer. A Windows server tends to be a little easier, and so they're very popular with smaller companies because we can do things. And in fact, we can show you what one looks like here because we have one in our back room that's running Windows. And so I'll try to show you that. So there actually is sort of a version of Mac OS X server. They really haven't approached that market very heavily yet. At one point they had something called an X server. They dropped it. It's not really where their niche is. What they have, Apple is very good about figuring out where they can make money. Does anybody like to make money? Apple is good at it. Almost every other computer manufacturer operates on very thin margins. In other words, if I sell a computer and I'm HP, I'm making $3 or $4 on it. I'm making a very small margin. Apple, on the other hand, makes about 40% margin when they sell a computer. So, two computers, if you sell them for $1,000 a piece, HP is going to make, $10, $20. Apple just made $400 on it. That's that margin of difference. And can I even really buy an Apple for at $1,000 now? Where are their prices at? They're a very high premium. Is it easy to spend $2,500, $3,000 on a laptop? It is. Now, I can also spend $2,500, $3,000 on a Windows 10 laptop, but just to throw that out there. And in fact, Apple is doing something very interesting today. Does anybody know what Apple stock is doing today? Do you guys keep up on stocks? So it's split. So Apple stock was a little over $500 a share. And for a lot of investors, $500 is kind of hard to come up with. They don't want to buy it in chunks of $500. And so Apple said, we're going to split that stock. So that doesn't mean the stock value decreases. You get 4 times as many stocks. So if you had one Apple stock yesterday, you have 4 stocks today. But instead of $500, they're $125. What that also, though, does is people will say, hey, I want to start investing in that because it's cheap enough I can buy 1 or 2 stocks. There are some companies that have never split their stocks. And the best example of that is a company called Berkshire Hathaway, based out of Omaha. Does anybody know Berkshire Hathaway? You've seen the name. They own Nebraska Furniture Mart. They own all kinds of other stuff. A guy named Warren Buffett. Their stock is well over $200,000 per share. I can't go buy that. If you could buy that, you're not probably in here, right? So Apple stock, though, I think today, here's my stock tip. Because they split, I think in this next week, you're going to see it go up at least 10% this week. Because people are going to go, yeah, I can buy it. And then on Friday, it's going to drop about 12% because then people are going to go, I made some money, I'm going to sell it. So I think Apple stock is going to move around a little bit. But they're not in the server market because there wasn't the money for them to be made. They're very, very smart. These guys at Apple have figured out the world. I'm wearing an Apple Watch. This thing was like $400, right? When you buy one. I can go to Wyze, W-Y-Z-E. They make all kinds of cameras and phone equipment and different weird things. And I can get a watch that will do everything this does now for $24.95. Do you think Apple made money on this watch? They market accessories. So the watch band, if you try to buy the watch band that looks like this one, it's a stainless steel mesh thing, and you buy it at the Apple store, you're going to pay about $400 for the watch band. I didn't because I bought this for $12 off Amazon. They know how to make money. They didn't know how to make money on the server market. Flip side of that is Microsoft. They know how to make money on the server market. So I said Windows 10 is about $200. When I look at Windows Server, it starts at about $1,000 and goes on up in terms of licensing. It's expensive. Licensing is expensive. On the other hand, if I'm willing to do it without support, without that ability to pick up a phone and call somebody, I can do the same thing with these Linux versions for free. For free. But I don't have that support. If I'm going to buy that support, it's going to be about the same price. If I get into more of the mainframe area or even the bigger ones, I can still run Linux, or I can run things like HP-UX or ZeOS. And this is where the big money starts to come in. And I don't know what the current price of some of that is, but it's priced by how many processors your computer has. It's priced on how much memory your computer has. Hospital in Falls City. I walked in there in 2009 to help them. So this is 10 years ago. They had an IBM system that they were using for their management system for billing and for patient care and everything. Had to buy a new server fairly quickly. That server that they bought at a little bitty hospital in Falls City was $280,000. 50-some thousand of that was licensing to send directly to IBM for their ZeOS system. 50 grand of that. That's a big chunk of money, isn't it? A year later, they were expanding. They'd built this new hospital. They needed some bigger space. Here's what I thought was really interesting. That server that they bought from IBM, we said, well, we need to add in 2 more cores. So there were 2 processors, and we said we need 2 more processors, and we figured we'd have to buy a board, and they're willing to charge us, I think it was $135,000 or something crazy. Here's what was interesting. As it turns out, that server actually had 4 cores in it, but because the license only was allowed to run 2, all we had to do was pay that licensing fee. They remoted in and turned it on and said, here you go. Now you have your 4-core system. Check, please. Isn't that crazy? And I will tell you, this server that we bought was about the size of one of these computers you see down here. It was not a whole room full of equipment. And it was mostly due to that licensing cost. But it's not just HP. We also had to upgrade our email system there that year. That hospital had about 200 email addresses. Had to buy from Microsoft because they wanted Exchange and all this. That was $90,000 in licensing costs. $87,000 something if I remember right. That's why we use things like Google Mail for you guys, right? Because that was 200 users. There's a reason why Bill Gates has $110 billion. All right. We have smartphones, and your smartphones are now so smart that they make us look dumb, right? There's a couple of other weird things that you're going to see. Embedded OSs. So you don't see a lot of the Windows stuff embedded except in things like ATMs now. So an ATM has an operating system, and every once in a while one will crash, and you'll walk up to it and you'll see that, oh, it's rebooting and it's running a version of an operating system. E-book readers, smartphones, network devices, media players, your gaming machines. Does anybody here have an Xbox? Xbox runs a version of Windows 10. On the other hand, if I have the PlayStation, does anybody have a PlayStation? A couple of you? Well, PlayStation has its own version, and it's based on a Linux version. If you have things like an Apple TV, it's got an operating system. It's really amazing when you start thinking about all the different things around here that have operating system in them. Up here in the ceiling, I don't know if you guys can see it, but each projector actually has an Apple TV box. That's got an operating system. The switcher there has an operating system. If you have something like this at your house, it's got an operating system on it. It runs and does things. So They're everywhere. We need to know about them. We need to know how to secure them. And that's where we kind of get to. So middleware is a lot of these things that stand in between. So it allows us to run our software, send it out to the network. And then we have that idea of application software. And there are so many kinds. So many kinds. But sometimes we need to make a distinction. So at Peru, there are things we do that we can't just go out to Microsoft and say, hey, we need Microsoft Office to do this. You guys all have an example of one. When you logged in and signed up for classes, you used something called MyPSC. That is considered proprietary software. In other words, it took a lot of development and writing that code to make it work for us. It was actually an effort between all of the state schools, so UNMC, UNL, UNK, Shatter and Wayne in Peru, all in together to start with, and it was about a $40 million project to start with. Wow. And part of that is what it had to do to maintain all those records. If we screw up your student records, is that a big deal? Is not getting your diploma a big deal? Yeah. Is billing you incorrectly a big deal? Yeah. So there's a lot of pieces in there that come into play. And now we've started to add new features that have taken a while to develop. Now you guys can literally go in and look and say, all right, I need these classes. And I know I can start scheduling them now more than one semester ahead. Now, COVID's put a little change in that because we don't know how some of these classes are going to land. But the more capabilities we add, the better it is for you. And that's what we call a proprietary software. There wasn't a package we could buy and walk out and say, all right, IBM, I need a piece of software that does all this. Now, what we started with is some database software, and then we built around it, but it was very expensive. Versus off-the-shelf software. So there's advantages and disadvantages. Off-the-shelf I can deploy immediately. It took 2 years to figure out MyPSC and to start with it. All the while there was a clock ticking because the company that made the software we used before that was going out of business, or at least ending their software for that. And so we had to get data out of it, get data in. Think about something like Blackboard. Blackboard kind of lays in the middle of all that. Do we modify Blackboard quite a bit for us? But it's also off the shelf because you can just buy Blackboard. Just as a guess, because I was on the committee that decided which version of an LMS, Learning Management System, and we ended up staying with Blackboard. UNL had migrated to something called Canvas, but there's a lot of different platforms. What do you think we pay a year for Blackboard? Does anybody have a guess? We don't host it on our campus. We host it on their stuff. What do you think we pay a year? Anybody want to guess? 50? Keep going up. 70, 80, 90? How about $100,000 a year almost? $100,000 a year. And we're not a very big school, are we? So picture what something like University of Wisconsin pays for 51,000 students, and we're paying this for 2,000 students. It's a lot of money. And we don't think about that because we're so used to, man, I'm cheap. I bought Microsoft Office, and wow, that was a lot of money. And I bought it at the student price for $79. Now you guys are getting it for free, and we don't think about those costs. If I'm in a business, just Microsoft Office, do you know what it costs to buy? Does anybody have a clue? So I'm a company, I need 1,000 licenses of it, and I need Microsoft Office, the full version. It's $449 a person per license for the full version. If I use Microsoft Office 365, like what you guys get to use, it's $140 per person per year. That's a lot of money, and we don't think about that. So that's why I want to make you guys aware of those things. So when you go into a business and you say, man, I just want to do something really cheap, and then you're buying thousands and thousands of dollars worth of software. So there is a way to make this a little cheaper. And one of the ways we do this is something called software as a service. And you guys are used to that. How many of you use Gmail? Everybody should raise their hand, because what's your email here? We don't host anything here. It's called software as a service. Typically, software as a service means you do it on a web interface. So you go to a website to do it. There's lots of these companies out there that are developing software as a service, and they charge you. So initially it's very cheap. So if I need something like a sales program to maintain sales and track that, I can go to Salesforce. If I need an operating system that's got all the Google Doc programs, I can buy it from Google. But wait, you guys got it for free, right? Well, they give it to you free as a college student to kind of entice you in there. If I'm actually buying Google Docs, it's $50 a year. That's pretty cheap until you think about, wow, wait a minute, I got 200 employees. That's a big chunk of money. So all different kinds of companies have software as a service. If I want to use it, I can do that. It just costs me some money. And so we're going to look at some of those in greater detail. So basic software for us, things like word processors. You may do a database. Spreadsheets are probably the most common thing. And it's one we hear a lot of employers say, you have to be able to run a spreadsheet and manipulate it. So if I bring in and I want to put you on a hiring committee, you need to be able to create a spreadsheet so you can put quantitative data down for them. We hear a lot about databases. Companies want you to learn how to use a database. Some of you may be in the database class right now or took it last spring. The reason we push that is that's what employers want. You're interfacing with a database all the time. When you use MyPSC on the backside, it's a database program. You may need to have some kind of graphic skills. This is one area I cannot help you because I am graphically challenged. But maybe you need to make illustrations or drawings or presentations. Those kinds of things. We use those a lot. And then we can put them all together. We bundle them all together. There's your Office 365. So there's competitors. So Google Apps, Apple has some. This open stuff we're going to talk about, and not with OpenOffice because I don't like that fork. We're going to look at one called LibreOffice, which really means free office. Libre, free office. And we're going to look at that one in here as a group. So you may even want to do taxes. Does anybody like doing taxes? No. You do? You like to do them? That is, okay. Does anybody like to have to do your own taxes and pay them? How about we phrase it that way? No. But is there money to be made? Does TurboTax make money? Does H&R Block make money? Does an accountant make money doing taxes? It's kind of the bread and butter for a lot of a lot of CPA firms. So you may also have things where I need to create a web page. You may even have this game thing. You want to play games. You may use something for statistics. Ooh. How many of you like statistics? How many of you just had a headache thinking about statistics? There are tools to help you with it. And a basic understanding of it, you'll see a lot of that come over and over and over again. So on our campus, we don't necessarily have a really great use for that. We use something called Winx that's on this lab. It's cheap because it was only a couple $100. SPSS is like $4,000 a year for a license now. It's crazy. But it's kind of the model. If you're writing research papers, you're probably using SPSS or Mathematica or some of the other ones. And then we have mobile. And this is where the growth has been. Because what do you guys all have in your pockets? You guys all have a phone in your pocket, and the sales value is astronomical. Apple doesn't make as much money selling the phone as they do selling that service and having that Apple store. Because every app in there, even the ones Apple didn't write, which is most of them, they make a cut or a percentage or a dollar amount. They make a pretty good chunk of money out of that. So every transaction through that Apple store, they make a piece of money out of. Google Play Store. So Apple Store, tightly regulated. The apps are vetted. The one thing that you do get for that money that Apple makes is they tend to check the programs and control them. The Google Play Store, on the other hand, is a little more like the Wild Wild West. I can get programs. Some of them are good. Some of them are going to infect my phone. So you got to be a little more careful with that. But if you want to talk where the money's at, mobile is really where some of this is at this point. And some of it's interesting, and it's hard to find what numbers it costs to develop that. But one that I do know of, and they touted some of the numbers. So there's a guy named Dave Ramsey, and some of you may have heard him. He's a financial guru, and he advocates budgeting and getting rid of all debt. Probably not a bad option either way. They wrote an app to create and it does a budget for you. And it originally was on the Apple platform only. Their initial development budget was $2 million for it. So it doesn't just magically happen free, but there is some money to be made on the back end of that. Now, other apps that have made a lot of money, anybody here played Pokemon Go? Yeah, the amount of money that generated was pretty phenomenal. And it didn't cost that, I mean, it was expensive to develop, but they made a lot of money on it. Some of the apps are developed by individuals, but there are apps for nearly everything you can ever possibly do. And it's disrupted the market. We used to have a separate GPS device in the car. Now you have your phone. You used to have something to store music on. You had these CDs or some other way you put music. Yeah, it's on the phone. And you Bluetooth it right there into your car. Business apps are on there. So maybe you want to look at trading and stock. It's on there. It's on there. There's all kinds of apps for anything you want to do. And some of them are a little dangerous. So you may have read this summer that there was a student at Kearney, but going to school at UNL, but not from the state of Nebraska, but that's where he was living at, got into the stock market. I'm going to tell you the stock market's a great place to invest, but he did some things where he's using some very advanced techniques, where you're putting up a very little money, but you're trying to control a lot of stock. Well, that's good as long as that stock goes up. If it goes down, you can lose a significant amount of money quickly. And on paper, he had lost about $280,000. He committed suicide. And that app, we're going to look at it in here. It's called Robinhood. I think it's actually, I invest stock money in it. I think it is a great stock trading app. But it also has some very powerful sides to it. And we have to be aware of those things when we start looking at it. Think about that if you looked at your stock report and all of a sudden you were $280,000 in the hole. Would you guys all be devastated at that point? Yeah. And as it turns out, because of a flaw in the way the software showed that wasn't actually even the case. So we're going to look at that in a little more in depth once we kind of get some of these things down. And then here's one of the biggest ones, social networking. Facebook for old people, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. What other ones are there for social networking? Snapchat, Instagram, we got that one already. LinkedIn. LinkedIn's a great one for business. So there are lots of them out there. There are even virtual bars. There's an app called FooBar. There are virtual apps. There's also ones that are frightening when we think about them a little bit. Has everybody heard of an app called Tinder? Everybody goes, yeah. I'm not saying anybody in here has an account on it. Tinder has 950,000 swipes per second in the United States. That's a huge number of people. Huge number of people. So all of these things we need to be aware of. Can they be useful? Yes. Can they also be a little on the creepy, dangerous side? Just like TikTok. I love to watch some of the TikTok videos. I'll start watching it, and the next thing you know, it's like 2 hours later. And there are some really clever, creative things. On the dark side of that is how do we use some of those? Some of you may have played games like Call of Duty. Has anybody played Call of Duty? Or a game like it? So, there's downsides to that. So, Call of Duty and games like it have been actually used by Al-Qaeda and other terrorist networks to send information. Oops, I thought it was a great fun game, and yet other people are using it for other resources. So we have to deal with that in everything we do. All right. All of these things we do are based on the idea of a programming language. And so at our college, we only offer one programming language and one course in programming languages. But that language is how we communicate with the computer, that interface between the computer and us. And it's all based on something called syntax or a language structure. So syntax is just how we do that. But when we look at languages, there are literally thousands. And so you're going to see some references to those. If you happen to know COBOL, COBOL was one of the first business programming languages, and it's used on those old mainframes that the banks use. Those programmers are dying off and retiring. If you happen to have some skills in that, holy cow, there's some money to be made trying to migrate off of there. So C and C++. So these are kind of the granddaddies of programming languages. When I look at Windows, it's actually written in C++. So even the operating system. Java you may have heard of. A lot of software runs on Java. And then we have the one we talk about and we introduce you to is called Python. Ruby's another language kind of similar to Python, but it's designed for web use. And then SQL, which really isn't a programming language, although they lump it in here. Structured query language. That's how databases operate. And that's that language of business. If I understand SQL and I know how to do database queries, again, that can be a really great asset to whatever job I have, as I can do my own queries. You guys have used SQL, you just haven't seen it. When you go to MyPSC and you say, I want all the classes that are only on Tuesday, Thursdays from 9 o'clock till noon, that's using SQL. So, there's some things that we need to deal with software, though. And one of them is going to be this idea of bugs. There is not a piece of software written that does not have some form of a bug or an error with it. And when I look at software that's got to support millions of different computers, I know that I'm going to have bugs. And so different examples have come out when Windows 10 arrived that they said, we think there's at least 60,000 or more bugs in this software. Companies try to fix them as quick as possible. They do patches and they do updates. But they have to be reported to them because sometimes they don't know. And here's where it's gotten interesting. Has anybody heard of the NSA in our country? Security, yeah? So the NSA looks for those bugs because they want to exploit and be able to get onto somebody's Windows 10 computer. And you'd think as a government agency they would promptly report to Microsoft and say, hey, there's a problem with your software here. But do they? No. So some companies do sell data about their users to either other companies or the federal government. And there has been right now, for one of the examples that we ran into, is cell phone companies. So no matter your beliefs on immigration in the United States, the federal government has been buying from the cell phone companies tracking information. When you have that phone on your body, not only does it really handy because you can get all this information, can we find you with that cell phone really quickly? There's tracking information, what you're doing on it. And cell phone companies have been known to sell that information to the federal government. So ICE likes to buy that data from the federal government, or even in some cases it gets given to them, and they can track people. Now, I think there's probably better ways to deal with it, but you see that all over the place. Missouri took cell phone data, and one of the things it was doing in Missouri is taking cell phone data to see how much traffic is on Interstate 70 and other major interstates. But if I can do that, how long before we start issuing you a ticket? Because we saw your cell phone in Kansas City, and then we saw it in St. Louis, and we figured out you had to be speeding to get there, right? Oh. So, a little off the subject, but you'll see some paranoia. And I teach a cybersecurity class where we learn about all kinds of fun things like that. So, software bugs. We also need to worry about licensing. Unlicensed software can be expensive or mislicensed. So many, many years ago, when I worked in outside plant engineering, we used to have to buy something called AutoCAD. AutoCAD is what you do your drawings with at the plants, and you do drawings for buildings and architecture and all those different things. Like many companies, so again, this is many years ago, and computers were really expensive then. Now they're just expensive. But a desktop was $4,000 to $5,000 for one that could run AutoCAD. And so when we replaced them, like most companies do, it went from, one of the AutoCAD staff, it went to, hey, one of the secretaries in the pool, or some of the administrators and staff. What we did, though, was we didn't always uninstall the AutoCAD software. So, did we inadvertently do it? No. Was it being used? No. But we had a disgruntled employee. And that disgruntled employee contacted something called the BSA. There's a software alliance group that they all get together. And they came into our place of business. And what they actually did was brought a federal warrant saying they have the right to look at all of that because of the licensing we had. And they came into our company, and we were not properly licensed. Now, did we do it accidentally? We weren't doing it on purpose. We didn't buy one copy and then just make multiple copies and throw it on every desktop. We made a mistake a lot of companies do. It was inadvertent. The end result was, though, we had to buy 20 copies of AutoCAD at full price. It was, at that point, it was like $6,000. A license, and we had about a $150,000 fine. It was expensive. Now, we had somebody who was grumpy with our company that we fired for a lot of reasons, but it can be expensive to not have the right license. It's one of the reasons why, as a business, we monitor and manage what you put on your computer. Because if you borrow a piece of software and install it on a computer at work, you can get the company in trouble. And that's one of the reasons we monitor and maintain it. And software that is legal for you to use as an individual isn't necessarily legal to use as a company. So we work very carefully with software and licensing to try to make sure that that is the appropriate license. So the even better story to my AutoCAD story was we got out of that business temporarily. So we stepped aside from doing that and went purely construction for a while. And then the markets shifted again, and we said, all right, we want to get back in. And so we bought all new desktops and started to figure out what we needed. And we're like, oh, yeah, we have all these licenses for AutoCAD. We can probably just do an upgrade to the latest version. We were less than a month out of the period where we could do that. We had to buy them all again. So AutoCAD is a giant thorn in my rear end for the cost of those. But it's that making sure that you're licensed correctly. It can cost your company a lot of money. So there are ways to get licenses cheaper, open source software. And so we can do a lot of things with that. So a lot of companies have moved to this open source model. Thank you, Apple Watch. So software, there's a lot of upgrades that'll come out. Depending on how you buy that licensing, you may include upgrades or you may have to pay for them when they come out. So if I have Windows 10, those upgrades are free. But if I have Microsoft Office and I bought a version called 2013 and I want to upgrade to 2016, now I have to buy those upgrades. If I have Office 365 and I keep it licensed, I keep the latest version. But again, that cost you have to weigh is that cost of that license, what does it cost me over time? So software upgrades typically are good if we do them security-wise. And then this idea of globalization comes in. So licensing requirements different in different countries. How do I deal with a company that is spread all over the world in terms of software and licensing? And so we're going to stop here. You need to read, so this is finishing up chapter 2. So please read for next Wednesday. I had to think of which class we're in here. Make sure you've read chapter 3. We're going to start looking at databases and we're going to start looking at some more interesting pieces. So we're also going to hopefully everybody's getting closer to being off quarantine.